Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. That code is going to stay in the upper right-hand corner. So we talked about feedback from caregivers. So feedback from adults is something that kind of expands and reinforces those gender differences. Around the age of 3, a child's peers become part of this process. This is the age at which boys and girls start separating into different packs of children. And it's at that point that those different choices in play really become more exaggerated. And the identities of children as boys and girls are reinforced by these play choices and splitting into different groups. We're not too far off from that point when boys and girls think of each other as having cooties and generally being gross. Thank you. Brooklyn. Mass media and advertising also are a part of this. At this age, unless as a parent you make sure that a child has no exposure to televisions, streaming services, any of that, mass media and advertising are going to start to influence the gendering of children. There are different shows targeted to boys and girls. My son watched Stinky and Dirty, and my daughters, especially my oldest, loved Sophia the First. And this plays back into those choices and what children want to play in or play with. And so my daughter wanted to dress up in a dress and carry around an amulet, and my son wanted to play with things like trucks and bulldozers. As children watch different shows, they may get different advertisement. This is probably less common today than it used to be. When I was a kid, even if you had cable, you had a limited range of choices, and the shows had to kind of throw out a wide net of ads for different stuff. But you definitely got boy and girl toys, and it would vary from show to show. The nurture side also points out, and this may be kind of run contrary to what we would think, right, as a society is more aware of these influences on gender, right? You might think that we would start later than in the past, but in fact, right, we start much earlier now than was once the case, especially if we're talking about American society. Until we reached the middle of the 1900s, or the middle of the 20th century, however you want to say it, kids' clothing was the same regardless of gender. Earlier in the 20th century, and of course before the 20th century, all really young children wore dresses. And really, from a practical standpoint, this was a genius thing, right? With potty training, much easier to just hike up a dress, right, than to have to get those little kid legging things off. Right? So can understand that. I'm not sure what their reasons for doing it were. Not entirely, but we'll see some that come in. And later, right, even as male and female children are not all wearing dresses, any gender differences in outfits are still very much muted. here there is a reason that males and females will both wear designs of clothing like this catalog image, which the designs and the colors are really not that different. I mean, yes, that's a pleated skirt and those are shorts, but otherwise the jackets, the collars are very much the same. The colors are identical. And this was because parents and broader society had a consensus that it was good to delay as long as possible kids thinking about the differences between the male and female sexes. And it was thought that early awareness of these differences was the path to debauchery. And that would have been the term that they would use. They would have had in mind things like sexual relations outside of the bonds of marriage, for example. And I'm sure other things that horrified them came into their minds. So as we think about this, right, and how this matters, I want you to tell me which of those two children, and you just pick the option, is Franklin Roosevelt, who would become the longest serving president of the United States. Again, don't say it out loud, just throw it into the pear deck. Don't Google it, that takes all the fun out of it. Give you about 10 more seconds on that timer to decide. All right, and the majority has it as number 2 is Franklin Roosevelt. All right, yeah, this is always kind of disappointing because you guys are too good at picking that out, either because you're doing image searches or you're just that good. Max.
I actually knew that.
You knew that one? Okay.
It's really weird because I think other presidents have done that before.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would have been very common. I mean, because again, this is just how people dressed small children. You had to put them in dresses, right?
I know the picture of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was quite the common thing. I mean, even much later, it was typical for, especially if you were taking your baby to church to be baptized, for denominations that do that, for there to be a dress that the baby wears. And it doesn't matter if it's a male or a female. My father-in-law, his brother, and their 2 sisters all used the same baptismal dress. The idea of my 6'4", 275-pound, very strong, bearded, manly-looking father-in-law in a dress is just an image that is simultaneously hilarious and devastating. All right. Okay, so what changed this? Money. The 1970s, the baby boom is over. The baby boom, for those of you that haven't had U.S. history yet, was that post-World War II massive trend of getting married and having lots of kids. And as soldiers are coming back from war, all of this is happening at the same time, which creates a baby boom. But that, again, is over in the 1960s, and by the time we hit the 70s, family sizes are noticeably shrinking. And the companies that made the clothing and the retailers that sold the clothing were watching their sales drop off. So what do? You got to figure out how you're going to sell at least the same amount of clothing, if not more, for fewer children, which means you are going to have to sell more clothes for each of that smaller number of children. And you do that by making sure that clothes for females and clothes for males are very different. And they definitely have done this. They've put this little hipster woodsy baby in buffalo plaid and a little explorer shirt. And even though he's not going anywhere, he can't even roll over yet. That kid is going to explore precisely wherever you put him, and that's it. Whereas a girl at the same age would get to be a pink, fluffy bunny. If you guys think that's bad, it is. I'm going into a Carter's store. This was after our daughter was born, and all we'd ever looked at before were the boys' clothes, which were always about like tough like daddy, had little tool belts printed on them and all kinds of things about accomplishing stuff. And then get over to the girls' side, and the slogans are things like, it's a lip gloss kind of day. Not having it. Not having it. There's nothing, if you love your lip gloss, there's no shame in that. But I'm sorry, I would rather my daughter be thinking about also being smart and tough and accomplishing things. Yes, Max.
My mom's got a framed picture of me dressed in a pink bunny suit just like that.
Yeah, that's because your mom probably grew up with the Christmas Story and the pink bunny that the aunt made for the 8-year-old boy.
When I had my short hair, I looked exactly like Alfie.
There you go. Then that's why. Figured there was a reason for that. Okay. But even here, we see that there is more gendering than just making the clothes different for the two. If we look at the clothing for little boys and little girls, we notice that there is more of an allowance for girls to wear blue. This does not mean that, as we get to the next one, that boys are physically incapable of wearing pink, but it is much, much less accepted, right? And certainly much less promoted than girls wearing blue. Right? Why is it that girls, right, can wear blue and it's seen as acceptable, but boys are discouraged from wearing pink? Let's take at least a minute on that one. Okay, so in the responses, mostly, I mean, what we see is that pink is associated with things like daintiness and femininity, whereas blue is more masculine. So what you guys are telling me is that it's okay for a girl to dress in a more masculine color, but not okay for a boy to dress in what's seen as a more feminine color. So we're not going to reopen the Pear Deck, but why is it okay for girls to maybe want to be a little more masculine and wear blue? Why is that okay? Yes, Max.
Well, I feel like it's because expectation on manliness is a little less harsh than expectation on femininity nowadays. Because I mean, everyone has like a predetermined expectation of manliness, and I feel like femininity is just a lot less heavily enforced.
Okay.
It's hard to get at.
You're on the right trail. What you're saying, what you're getting at, I think, is if there is a correct answer to this, what I think it probably is. And that is, it's like the valorization of masculinity, right? So being masculine is good, because remember, masculine is superior. Not saying as a reality, but right, if we're thinking about this as gender conflict theorists would tell us, right, because of the valorization of masculinity, all things masculine are seen as superior. Right? So naturally, a girl would want to be able to get in on a little of that superiority by wearing blue. I mean, you're never going to get all the way there because it's just clothes, right? You're still a girl, right, Rakaya? I'm just kidding. I know, because I can just tell that like the thought of that makes you angry, right? And I get that. But for a boy to want to give up that masculinity and wear pink, that is almost seen as like gender treason. And so think about this. What do we call a girl that kind of dresses and acts more like a boy? A tomboy. What do we call a boy who wears pink and maybe doesn't do masculine things? Well, I grew up in a different time. I'm just going to tell you what they would have been called at that time period. And it's not nice, and it's seen as a lot more closer to a slur today, if not actually a slur, than it was in the 80s, a sissy, right? So, right, one was seen as like an acceptable thing, right, and the other was clearly rejected and stigmatized. Right? And so you do see that. All right, nicely done. This, of course, does not stop with us being children. These gender differences are continually created and recreated through our experiences, and as a result, reinforced as well throughout our lives. School socialization is part of this. Male and female students are shunted into different subjects and different activities. Girls are more likely to be pushed towards things like English language arts, and really specializing in that. And boys more likely to be pushed towards the hard sciences and math, right, and activities, right, as well. We have different sports. Some sports girls were not allowed to participate in. A lot of that's changing. The wrestling team at Central. We also see it in the workplace. And if you feel like we didn't spend enough time talking about school, don't worry. We're going to come back to that with the evidence for the nurture side. We also see it in the workplace. Different careers. Females are still much more likely to be in what are called the nurturing professions, like being a nurse, or the caring professions, we might call it, being an elementary school teacher. There are also different opportunities for promotion. Men are much more likely, at least as of now, to have opportunities to move up within a company or organization. It's also in terms of what they wear. And this is not from American society. I think that's from like Singapore Airlines. There's less differentiation in the United States, but this kind of shows it. I mean, the pilot wears a shirt and a tie. He's got epaulets on his shoulders, which makes him look almost military, even though he's a commercial pilot. Right? Whereas the flight attendant wears that skirt, right? The little hat that doesn't do much of anything, but I guess look nice. And they will be expected to fit that uniform, and that uniform is only going to come in a certain range of sizes. And that was actually true as well in the United States until not so very long ago. I think it lasted into the 90s that flight attendants were expected to wear girdles to get that feminine shape. And we also see it in the government. And probably the most striking example of that for our society is the male-only conscription. In other countries, that kind of socialization is very different. In Israel, it's males and females conscripted, both serve in frontline combat duties routinely. And then, of course, also socialization as members of a family, right? Particularly as adults, mother and father roles. We see still today, right, women are much more likely to get what we called earlier that second shift. Right? They may leave the home to work and make money. When they come back, they're still more likely to be stuck with domestic duties than their male partner. I will tell you, no matter what you think about anything else, that guy's a deadbeat. Don't be one of those, and don't pick one of those to spend your life with. Okay. So the conclusion for the nurture side. Gender is handed down not as a genetic inheritance, but instead the nurture side tells us that it is due to socialization. Okay, and we are going to, if you notice, there's no exit slip yet. There is one, I just haven't published it, and I don't think I'm going to. I don't want to hedge our bets and make sure that we get as far into this as we can today, since tomorrow we only have 30 minutes. Let's start looking at the evidence for the nurture side now that we've seen their arguments. First up, we'll start with the brain. Lees Elliott in 2021 did a massive meta-analysis, which means looking at the results from lots and lots of different scientific studies about the differences between male and female brains. And the only thing that is consistently different is the total size of the brain. The nature side tells us that there are other important differences, like hippocampus and amygdala. And remember, amygdala size is important for things like political views. There are also claimed to be different ratios of white matter to gray matter. You guys don't worry about what any of that means right now. This is not a human anatomy class, so we're going to keep it as light as we can on that front. And then what we were more familiar with from our look at the nature side is those front to back connections that were supposed to be much more common in men and versus side to side connections, which were supposed to be more common in women. All of those differences disappear when you control for overall brain size. The actual proportions of white matter, gray matter, hippocampus, and amygdala are similar. Right? Smaller brain, smaller amygdala. Larger brain, larger amygdala. But it's proportional. And those connection differences are also mostly accounted for by overall brain size. So to translate that into something closer to plain English, differences between men with giant noggins and little noggins are as big as the differences between males and females. So I have a giant fat head. It's a wonder I ever learned to walk, right? Or basically that I ever learned to actually even sit up without just toppling over with that giant fat head perched atop my little bitty neck. No, don't worry. My neck got bigger. It had to support this giant head. Otherwise, I'd just walk around like this all day and probably in loops as it pulled me around. Glad that part's not being recorded for the future. It's not a pretty sight. But I have a giant fat head. There's only one thing that my father-in-law and I wear in the same size, and that's hats. It's a little embarrassing. Actually, he says that my hats are a little bit big on him, which is terrifying. My grandfather, on the other hand, he had some awesome hats that I'll never be able to wear because he wore a size 7 1/4 and I wear a 7 5/8. What the science says is that I would have many more front to back connections, and my grandfather would have had more side to side connections, even though we were both males and both identified as men. But even then, no differences are substantial enough to be a reason for different abilities. And certainly, I would never claim that my grandfather was less good at visual spatial skills than I am. After World War II, he was an aviation mechanic and worked on some of the first jets. He was later an engineer for Burlington Northern. I'm a school teacher. So at least in that very limited sample of examples, those differences aren't that severe. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Eliot also looked at cross-national studies. Well, she took a cross-national view of studies in her meta-analysis by looking at studies that were focused on U.S. samples. So all of the people studied would have been from the United States, and other studies where everyone in the study was Chinese. What those comparisons found is that there were not consistent differences between males and females if you look at more than one country. And again, try to get this closer to plain English. What this tells us is that those social, societal differences, maybe due to culture, might be more important than biology, might be more important than sex. And another problem for these studies and what Eliot found is that most of them have not been replicated. It's not that people haven't tried. People have followed the research design of other researchers, but have not been able to get the same result. And that's where Neil deGrasse Tyson, I've not muted him. Yeah. I can't let you, Max. He's fine. Hang on, we're almost there. So that's not the answer you wanted. All right, let's. Okay. And he points out that that is something that is very common to scientific investigation. But what that does point to is some of the evidence about differences between brains don't have support across more than one study, and that's a problem. Because replication is what we require for accumulating scientific knowledge. if we did have a lot of replication that was successful, according to the nurture side, we would know that these theories about the biological roots of gender would have a lot of support, and those theories would be strong. But without successful replication, our theory might be wrong. And of course, the nurture side is using this to argue that the nature side is wrong. People still typing on that slide? Okay. Actually, let's go ahead and stop there. I don't want to get into that and then just basically have to repeat it when we start up tomorrow. Okay, remember, tomorrow is going to be a much truncated class period. And then also, just to give you a heads up, I will not be here on Friday. Your Friday routine is going to be very much like our normal routine. It will all be in Canvas. You're going to have a discussion assignment about the nature versus nurture debate regarding gender. Okay, so I just want to give you a heads up for that. I'm not saying you guys are going to miss me and you need to prepare for that, but just to let you know in terms of the routine what's coming. All right, at this point, guys, you may get your phones out. That's fine. These last couple of minutes,